What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to integrate auth.js with SvelteKit. Auth.js is a really amazing way to manage authentication for your website without using an external provider like Supabase or Clerk. It's really simple to use, and it supports any OAuth service. In this video, I'm going to show off how to use GitHub with auth.js, but you can really use any OAuth provider you want. The steps are going to be very similar. So if we go in here and press sign in with GitHub, it's going to bring us to this GitHub sign-on page. We can then press authorize Cooper Codes. We will then be redirected back to our website with a signed in user from GitHub. A cool part of this tutorial is I'm going to show you how to grab the GitHub access token, or the access token for whatever OAuth service you're using. I'm then going to use the access token to get my followers list. So I can press this button here, and it's going to give me a list of all of my GitHub followers. And then of course, if we press the sign out button, we are going to get signed out. So let's do that right now. Let's get started by opening a blank folder in VS Code. All right, so now we're over in VS Code with a completely empty project. I'm going to pull the terminal up here like this, go over to terminal, and now we can create our SvelteKit project by saying npm create svelte-add, and then the name of our project, which I'm just going to say login-test. I want to use the skeleton project here, so you can use the arrow keys to go up and down, select skeleton. I'm going to use TypeScript with the TypeScript syntax. I'm going to press yes there. And I don't need any of these extras, so I'm just going to press enter. All right, so our project has been created in this login test here. I'm going to enter this created project by saying cd login test like that. And then I'm going to install two additional packages for the actual authentication logic. I'm going to say npm install @auth/core, which is the auth.js core library, and then also @auth/SvelteKit, which is the SvelteKit specific stuff for this library. We can then press enter. For this video, we are going to make some environment variables. So just in case, you want to npm install --dev, so as a dev dependency, .env, which allows us to use a .env file for environment variables. So we can press enter to install that. So before we write any Svelte logic, we need to set up our environment variables. So we can go up here and create a .env file. Inside of here, we are going to make environment variables specific to our OAuth project. This can include something like a client ID or a client secret, but we don't have any of those variables yet. So let's go over to GitHub and create our OAuth client. So I've gone over to github.com and I'm already logged in with my account. So if you're not logged in, go to the top right and just sign in. Eventually you can press your little profile icon here and you're going to want to go to settings. Inside of settings, you're going to want to press the developer settings if you scroll down on the left here. Inside of developer settings, you're going to have the option to create an OAuth app. So right here, we can press OAuth apps. You'll see I already have some older applications in here, but I'm going to press new OAuth app in the top right. We can create an application name. I'm just going to say login test app. I know, I'm creative. For the homepage URL, we are going to just use the local host URLs. If you're deploying to a production environment, the only change you'll have to make is to make sure to change these URLs to whatever your production URL is. And I'm going to cover that further in a second here when I finish this URL down here. You can make an application description such as subscribe to Cooper Codes, or else your authentication project will break. I actually heard that's true, so you should probably do that. Okay, I'm just messing with you guys there. For the authorization callback URL, this is a URL that our authorization is going to use in the background, and it has to be a very specific path. So it has to be http://localhost 5173/auth/callback/GitHub. So this is the specific auth callback URL for GitHub specifically. So each provider has its own URL. And so if I were to use Facebook instead, it would be /Facebook. If I were to use Google, it would be /Google. You can look specifically at the auth.js documentation for what this link is, but for GitHub, it's simple, just /GitHub. I'm just going to enable device flow because it seems like fun. It technically what it does is it allows you to sign in through the command line. I'm not doing that in this tutorial, but you guys can try it out. So if you guys wanted to deploy your OAuth application to production, for example, you would change your homepage URL and your callback URL by doing this. You're going to want to make sure it's HTTPS if you're using an HTTPS link, and then whatever the name of your website is. For example, we can do google.com. So if we were to do the authentication for Google, it would be that. And down here, you would do the same thing where it would be your google.com, and then you just do the exact same callback path like that. But make sure to Control Z and have your regular localhost 5173, because this is what we're going to be interacting with locally. So now we are all set to register our application here. So hopefully you guys have this env file created in the background. I'm going to start by getting our client ID here, copying it, going over here and saying GitHub_ID is equal to that string. Then I'm going to go over to our client secrets. I'm going to press generate a new client secret. This thing is only ever going to show once. If you accidentally don't get this or it goes away from you, you can just make another one, but it's only going to show once to you. And we can save this as GitHub_secret is equal to this string here. And with auth.js, there's one more interesting environment variable we have to add, which is auth_secret. This has to be a string of a random 32 characters, so we're not going to get this from any external source. There's this cool website you can use called generatesecret.versal.app, and it's going to give you a random 32 characters. You see, if I keep refreshing this, I will continuously get random characters forever. But we can use any of these, copy it, and bring it over to our application like this. This auth secret is something that auth.js uses in the background. We're actually never going to work with it directly, so if you're like, why do we have to do that? It's because auth.js is using it in the background. And so before we get into the setup part here, I'm going to quickly add Tailwind to this application. There is this really cool library called svelte-add. And so we can say npx svelte-add at latest, and then TailwindCSS. Usually setting up Tailwind is a pain, but if you run this command in your SvelteKit application, it's going to set up everything for you to the point where you can just instantly start using Tailwind classes. This is just going to make our application look okay when we're working on it in this tutorial. So you can press enter there. Then you're going to want to run another npm install for everything that they just added through Tailwind CSS there. All right, now we're good to go, and we can do an npm run dev to see our site running locally. To make things look a little bit nicer, I'm going to add some padding around the website so it's not directly on the corner here. And then we're going to get into creating the auth.js client. So we can access this route here, just localhost 5174, by going into our source folder, going into our routes, and going into the plus page.svelte. I'm going to make a little div around our content here, and it's just going to have a simple class is equal to p-24. This is going to give a padding of 24 around our text. And so now our text won't be so in the corner, but this isn't really a UI tutorial, just to make things look a little bit better. All right, so now we can actually initialize auth.js in our project. So if we go over to our source folder here, at the very top, so even outside of our routes folder, we want to make an auth.ts. This is where the actual auth client will live in our SvelteKit application. And the only thing that's going to happen in here is we are going to create the client. So to create the client, we want to import SvelteKit auth from auth/SvelteKit. And we also want to import the certain provider we're using. So we can say import GitHub from @SvelteKit/providers/GitHub. And this is a default export, so you can make it name whatever you want. So I'm just going to do the correct capitalizations there. I'm then going to import our GitHub ID and our GitHub secrets from our env variables. So you can do import GitHub ID and then GitHub_secret. So to access this .env file within SvelteKit, you can always use this env static private. And so this is actually getting the values of these env variables here. So back to auth.ts, we can then build our little SvelteKit auth by saying SvelteKit auth like this, and it's going to take in a config object like this. The config object is going to have a very important property called providers. So this providers property here is going to be an array of all the different providers you want your application to use. And so we can use the GitHub provider like this. And this GitHub provider is actually an object that also has its own config object here. And so what this provider object is pretty much looking for is all the different things it needs to set up the GitHub provider. We firstly need to tell GitHub that the client ID is going to be GitHub_ID. And then the client secret is going to be GitHub_secret. That's all you need to do to enable GitHub in your application. You could also do any other provider. So let's just say other provider, and you can stack them just like this. And that's not a real provider, so it's going to give me an error. But you can pretty much have a list of all the different providers you're allowing someone to use in your application. but for us, it's just GitHub, so we're just going to have this. And this SvelteKit auth is going to export something very important. So we can say const object is equal to SvelteKit auth. This is syntax you'll see a lot in JavaScript. What it pretty much means is this SvelteKit auth is creating an object, and we want some of the things that it is creating. For example, we want the handle from a SvelteKit auth. And so we need to export const handle. And this handle is very important because it allows us to handle server requests. So for example, if GitHub talks back to our application, it is handled by the handle here, but we're not using it quite yet. One thing we need to make is the plus hooks.server.ts. You could imagine plus hooks.server.ts to be the way that other servers communicate with your SvelteKit application. It's kind of strange syntax, but in order to use the handler inside of our application, we can just say export handle from /auth. This means that any server request that's incoming to our SvelteKit application is going to be handled by the authentication here. It definitely does kind of work in the background, so if this syntax is confusing, hopefully it makes more sense once we get to the end of the project here. So now we can head over to our page.svelte and create some functionality to log in our user. So in our page here, I'm going to make a script at the top here. Gonna make sure I set its language equal to TypeScript. And before we get designing some components, I'm going to introduce a couple things to show you how the authentication works. The first thing we can do is import some functions called sign in and sign out. And these are being exported from @auth/SvelteKit/client. This auth SvelteKit client is how we communicate with the SvelteKit client. So you could imagine if we do a sign in function call like this, it's going to run the logic to sign in user, doing everything for us, and then sign out is going to run the logic to sign out user. And you'll see for the sign in, we can even use a certain provider. For example, we're going to sign in with GitHub like this, which, as you guys could imagine, is use the sign in with GitHub logic, which is something that they've already developed for us. So all we have to do is tell it to use the GitHub provider. Another important part here is to import the page from $app/stores. This is where all of our page data gets stored. But importantly, we can access the user's current authentication session by going to $page.data.session. And this is going to show us stuff like the user, an image they have, and other things like that. And so to make what's in the session obvious, especially for beginners, is I'm going to console.log $page.data.session like that. And again, guys, this is your authentication session. So if you're ever confused as to where is the user, what's happening with them, it's always going to be in this page data.session. And so down here, we are going to make a if statement that's pretty much going to say, if the user is logged in, show something. If the user is not logged in, show something else. So I'm going to go in here and say $if $page.data.session. So if that's an actual object that exists, show something. Then I'm going to do an else statement here, show something else, and then I'm going to close off our if like this. And so if the user is logged in, I'm just going to show a simple header saying you are logged in. And if they're not logged in, I'm going to show a simple header saying you are not logged in. So if we go over to our website right now, we can see that we are currently not logged in. And if we inspect element here, our current page session is undefined. There's nothing in there. And so in the you are not logged in part of this, we can make a button that the user can click to log in. So I'm going to say sign in with GitHub. I'm also going to make some styling here for the button. So I'm going to say bg-blue-500, py-1, so padding in the y direction of 1, and then px-2. So let's save this. Boom, boom. So there's our sign in button. I can make that look a little bit better. Let's go in here. I'm going to say rounded text-white and then font-bold. All right, it's not the best thing I've ever seen, but listen, it's going to work, so that's all we need. Right now, if we press this button, there's no functionality actually happening. We can go in here and make an on click, and we can set it equal to an arrow function. So this arrow function is defining the logic of what we want to have happen here, right? We can then call this sign in function from above and use a specific provider. So for example, GitHub. And you can see my VS Code's autofilling all the different supported providers. You got Notion, you got Pinterest, you got Reddit, you got everything in there. And so I'm just going to use GitHub like this. And that's going to start the sign-in process for GitHub. So the sign-in with GitHub isn't going to work quite yet because we have to pass the current session to the page.data.session. And guys, before we do that, I'm realizing I made a mistake on the plus hooks.server.ts here. It should just be hooks.server.ts like that. And I made that mistake because I was thinking of this next thing we have to make, which is plus layout.server.ts. This layout is actually where we pass the current session into the page.data.session. So we can go over to layout.server.ts, and the layout always has a very important load function. So it's going to load server side any data we need. And so you can import the server side load type in TypeScript by saying import type layout server load from types like that. And so we can export const load is typed to layout server load is equal to an async function that has the current server event that we're going to pass into an arrow function here. Or sorry, this entire thing is an arrow function is what I meant. So inside of this asynchronous function, what we're going to do is we're going to return an object, which is going to be our page.data. So inside of this page.data object, we can say that the session is equal to await event.locals.auth. Event.locals, if you look here, allows us to have data that was added to the request within the handle hook. So handle's adding some stuff to event.locals for us. That might be kind of complicated for this tutorial, but we can even see event.locals dot is going to show us everything that the handle hook is giving us. And remember, that's the hook we added in hooks.server.ts. And auth is what allows us to get the user's current authentication session. We can then press save here to save this, and now we know that when our page loads, we're going to get access to the user session. So let's go over to page.svelte, and I restarted my application because sometimes it can be weird with the layout.server.ts, so be sure to do that. So I'm going to press npm run dev now. Our site is now showing our you are not logged in, sign in with GitHub. So we can now press sign in with GitHub. It's going to redirect us to that OAuth link, and it's doing all this in the background. So even if you choose a different provider, it's going to send you to this link here. I'm then going to press authorize Cooper codes. And it's going to send me back to the you are logged in. And you'll see our page.data.session has an object which shows when the token expires, and it also shows who our current user is. And so we can actually show this data to our website here. So let's make some functionality that's going to show this to our user. And even in our console here, we can see what the session currently is. So I'm going to do an if statement that says if the user has an image, because not every single OAuth service is going to provide an image like this. So if $page.data.session.user.image, and user might not exist, so I have to do a question mark here to make that happy. This question mark, if you've never seen it before, pretty much means if the user exists, then grab the .image property. It's not doing like an if statement or anything like that, but it's like, that's kind of the logic behind it. And so I'm just going to make a simple image here. I'm going to give it a class of width-12 and height-12 because it's going to be my profile image. So it's just going to be a square. It's going to have an alt of equal to user profile. That's just for anyone with like a screen reader or anything like that. And then the source of the image is going to be equal to this right here. Boom. So if we go back to our site, we can see we have our little login image. And it's technically a square, but I have a white background for my image, so it doesn't look great here. And I can also do something like this, where I can say, well, paragraph signed in as, and then the $page.data.session.user. And then instead of getting the image, we're going to do question mark dot name. So it's going to grab the username, which is going to show us signed in as Cooper codes. So let's go. That's who I am. And finally, let's make a little sign out button. And I'm just going to copy the button we had from before to make our lives easier with all that styling on it. And I'm going to change the text of the button to be sign out. And instead of calling the sign in function, I'm just going to call the sign out function, which again is something provided to us from auth/SvelteKit/client. Kind of an interesting side note, but if we ever have some logic where a user doesn't press a button, but you want to force them to sign out or force them to sign in, right? you can just run these functions wherever you want. You don't only have to run them when the user clicks a button. But if we go back to our application here and then we refresh, we can then press the sign out button. And it's going to sign us out and our session gets cleared. You guys will see that GitHub is actually doing some caching for us. And so if we try to sign in again, it's not going to put us through the GitHub process at all. And it's instead just going to give us the same session. And we are just a signed in user like usual. And so this is kind of the full authentication part of the video. I'm now going to show you guys how to access the user's access token. Access tokens are important for if you want to get a certain GitHub service or get a certain Google service with a certain user's access token. This is the way you can do it with auth.js. So we can go on over here and we're actually going to edit our auth.ts here, so our auth client. And so the auth client gives us access to something important called callbacks. These are functions that get called when things happen. For example, does a JSON web token get sent to server? Or does a JSON web token change? Which means you want to change the session with whatever is in there. These are things that you can do with the callback functions. So I can say async JWT, and so this JWT function is called whenever the JSON web token gets created or updated. Auth.js only uses portions of these tokens, which is why you have to do unique logic for it. So for example, this JSON web token has some parameters, for example, like the new token or the user account, which is only available when someone signs in or signs up. This account is going to this account variable here is what has the access token. And so if an account exists and it's not just some other type of token change, then the token.access token is going to be equal to account.access token like this. And then we are going to return our token. This is kind of some strange logic, but whenever our JSON web token changes, it's then going to trigger a change to our session. Kind of like what I talked about here, but it was pretty brief. It has a similar async session callback right here. And inside of here, you get access to the session, token, and the user. Inside of here, we can say session.access.access_token is equal to token.access token, just like we defined above. It's literally going like top down through these routes, even though they're in different functions. Also, we're technically changing things to the sessions TypeScript, so I know I'm going to get a flame for this. I'm going to use an @ts-ignore just to make the tutorial more simple. I'm not going to mess with the session types, but if you look up auth.js change session types, you'll find some stuff on it. And I'm going to finally return the session. So now we actually have to go back and re-log in the user because this access token only gets updated when someone signs in or when they sign up. So let's go back to our site and we can then press sign out. We're going to have an empty session, then we can sign in again. And boom, when we sign in, the user's access token gets applied to our current session. So even on the web client here, we have access to the access token. This is great if you want to do any client-side requests. For example, we can make a button to get a user's followers. So hopefully you guys have at least one follower on GitHub to do this. But it will even send you an empty array if you got no followers. So let's go back to our code here and we can go over to our page.svelte and I'm going to copy the logic for the button again. And I'm going to make it a bit of a different blue color. Actually, let's make it darker. So blue 800 here. And it's going to say get followers list. And we can instead call a function instead of this. So I'm just going to say get follower list for a certain user. Before we make the get follower list, let's go check that this button actually looks good. All right, so we got our two buttons here. I think that's fine for now. And so we can scroll up and make an async function get follower list just like this. And so now this function call right here is going to call right here. And so just to reference what I'm using is I'm using this GitHub documentation here where we can do a simple get request to /user/followers with a certain access token to then give us the user's followers. I'm going to convert this code here into JavaScript code pretty much. So we can go over to JavaScript and we can do that fetch request to the GitHub API by saying await fetch. And then the link is going to be https://api.github.com/user/followers. Then inside of here, we can pass in some options. For example, the headers, it's very specific about, you have to have an accept header of this weird GitHub format, which is application/vnd.github plus JSON. And then you're going to have an authorization header, which is going to be bearer which is a common syntax for if you use a user's token. It's going to be bearer, a space, and then the token. And we can get the token from $page.data.session.access_token. This is not going to like us because of TypeScript. So again, I'm going to do an @ts.ignore, but that's the last one because again, it's using that session and it doesn't like it when we change the session types. A weird one here is we're going to have to do an x-github API-version. I could talk about what API versions are, but pretty much it's telling us that there's a certain snapshot in time. So this one is 2022/11/28. This is a snapshot in time when GitHub says we're going to support this version of the API for a long time, even if we release new ones. And so you'll see API versions happen in that context, especially for really big APIs. This is the specific version you have to use to get access to this request here. And because we're passing in this access token right here, it knows who the user is. So we don't have to say any weird like username or anything like that. So when this request is done, we're going to say .then, grab the data of the request, and then we're going to transform it into a data.json. So I'm going to say return data.json. It's going to put the data into a JSON format. And then I'm going to say .then. The data is kind of continuing through the pipeline is a way to think of this. And then I'm going to console.log data like this. Data is actually going to be an array where it's user1, user2, user3, etc. And so we can actually save this array inside of a simple variable in SvelteKit. So I'm going to scroll above and just say let follower list be equal to an empty array for the time being. And this new data is then going to replace it. So I'm going to say follower list is equal to data. And I'm just going to console.log follower list as well. Oh, and I'm actually going to make this follower list be an any type. I know, guys, this isn't really a TypeScript tutorial, but I don't want to spend time typing it exactly to how GitHub has it here. But now we should be able to press this get follower list, and we're not going to see anything yet, but in the console, it's going to show us this array of users. So let's go back to our site here, and we can see we have an empty array at least. And so I'm going to press get follower list. Oh, and it's going to give us a list of 30 objects, which are all of my GitHub followers, or at least the first 30. And so you can see this .login property has the user's name. And so that's what I'm going to show throughout the list here, is I'm going to show each user name like that. So we can go down here and do a very simple each statement inside of Svelte. I'm just going to make a simple unordered list, and I'm going to limit its width. So I'm going to say class is equal to width-64. Then I'm going to say for each follower list as item, comma, index. This allows us to go over each object in the follower list. So I'm going to say /each at the end. And I'm just going to make a simple list item like this, where it's going to show the item.login, because that's what we saw is the user's kind of simple name. It's going to yell at us for the IDs here because it wants every single item to have a unique ID. So I'm going to say ID is equal to follower plus index. And I'm going to limit the width here too to say class is equal to width-64. So when the follower list gets loaded, it's going to load in each thing as a list item like this. And so I just refreshed my page over here so we can then do a get follower list. And boom, it's going to give me a bunch of followers from my GitHub. And this might not seem like much, but whatever OAuth service you decide to use, you have access to that access token. So whatever API requests you have to do, anything along those lines can be handled even within auth.js. And it took us a while to get there, but we're building out some pretty decent functionality, even if it doesn't look the prettiest. All right, guys, hopefully this was a really helpful introduction into auth.js and using it with SvelteKit. I think for early on projects, using something like auth.js to be a really quick solution can be helpful before you move on to something like Supabase for authentication or Clerk like authentication. So I mainly made this video to give you guys a bunch of different options. I am a YouTuber and I am shameless, so if you made it this far, feel free to check out my website, thecodeletter.com. I've been working on this a bunch recently, even with my own writer, and it's been going great. We've been having a lot of really amazing articles being written, and it's super time efficient. I'm not here to waste your time with my newsletter, so it's kind of a really cool service where you get to know all the latest events in tech. And yeah, I'd suggest you go subscribe. Otherwise, guys, thank you so much for watching.